My topic may be a little less controversial, but it certainly fits with this idea of structural adjustment, structural change and reform. So what I'm going to really focus on today is the role of preferences and demand in ongoing structural adjustment in many countries, in the high-income countries, but it's also happening in China, and what implications that has for both the private sector and for public sector planning. So I think the slides start with an assertion here. I think it's accurate to say that most international trade analysis focuses on the production side of general equilibrium. We're always looking for explanations and policy based on production. And an awful lot of politics and planning for development really focuses on goods and exports of goods. But we have a less of an understanding about the demand side of general equilibrium, and in particular, how the path of development is affected by the choices people make as their incomes rise. Okay? And I think this is very important because over time you're going to see what we have seen in the high-income countries, that there is going to be very different skill requirements for good jobs. There's going to be upward pressure on the gap between skilled and unskilled wages, which is already happening in China. And there's going to be new and different education and infrastructure requirements as the economy changes over time. And these in turn have lots of implications for things like urban planning. Okay, so I'm just going to assert to you, we don't have time for a lot of data right now, that there's a lot of empirical regularities across countries that if one chooses to look at the data. First of all, over many countries, we've had rising income per capita or at the household level. Secondly, there's been dramatic changes in the composition of final consumption that have kind of been missed by certainly a lot of international trade economists. There's a falling share of expenditures go on food and durables, and a rising share of expenditures go on services and non-durables. That we've seen in many countries long periods of rising skilled wage premium, which is basically the difference between skilled and unskilled wages. This has happened across a great range of countries, both from very high income to lower income countries. So here's a picture for China. The vertical axis is 100%, so this is household consumption in China over a relatively short period of time, 1985 to 2012. And I think you can read the legends there. I won't go through it in detail, but what we see is that over time there has been an increasing share of expenditures go on these categories like recreation, education, and cultural services, transportation and communication, medicine and medical services. These things are taking a larger share of total expenditure. The share of food has declined dramatically, and I think there's going to be great future changes in China where the share of manufactured goods begins to decline. So for comparison, this is the United States over a very much longer period of time, a little bit finer classification. And again, there's been really dramatic changes over a much longer period of time where the share spent on food shrinks dramatically, and then even the share on manufactured goods shrinks dramatically. And the service categories, which are at the top of the graph, really expand over time. Okay? So let's compare those two. Here's a comparison of that for China for this much shorter period of time, and the US for a longer period of time. And the classifications aren't quite the same in the data, but I've broken it down into food and a bunch of services, as you can see, such as transportation and communications, recreation, education, culture, medicine, and so forth. And you see a similar pattern there that's happening, that the share of food shrinks quite substantially, And the share that's spent on these groups of services increases really quite dramatically in percentage points. The levels are still quite different between the US and China if you look at the food share, but I think that it's probably a reasonable assumption that over time that this pattern will continue to evolve in China, and it will begin to look more and more like the high-income countries as the years go by. Okay, so what are some of the other things? I'm going to show you some more data, and then I'll draw some conclusions on this. This is a phenomenon known in the high-income countries known as the hollowing out of the middle class. It goes by different things: increased inequality, increased spread in things. And what we see this is US data, because that's probably our best data, and on the horizontal axis, households are lined up by percentile. The poorest 1%, the next poorest 1%, and so forth, up to 100% of all households. And what we've seen over a long period of time in the US and other high-income countries is this increasing inequality, where in particular the middle class, the middle of the income distribution, has been squeezed quite badly. In other data sets, it seems that the middle class in the United States has not had any. I thought you could hear me, no? I don't know what just happened, but let me just go on. The middle class has been really squeezed. This is not a matter of politicians claiming this is true. This is absolutely true. And the questions are really not whether this is happening, but why, and what can be done about it. Most all of the gains in per capita income in the United States in the last 25 years have gone to the very top end of the income distribution. Well, is that something peculiar to just high-income countries? And the answer is no. We have seen, it's hard to get comparable data on this across countries, but we've all seen there, to the extent there is some data, we see the same pattern of a rising gap between skilled and unskilled wages in many developing countries as well. So if you look at this is over the period for China. The number here is 1992 to 2006. It comes from a paper by Paro, and 40% increase I think this is the ratio of skilled to unskilled wages. So this pattern of relative wage change and rising inequality is by no means confined to just the high-income countries, which is very interesting in itself and requires an explanation. Okay, so this rising skill premium, there's a number of explanations, and we have no time to go through the theory. One is trade liberalization, but while that explains something for the high-income countries, it doesn't work very well for the developing countries. Secondly, the labor economists love to talk about something called skill-biased technical change, but there's actually very little evidence for this, and there's now increasing evidence that this is not that big a part of the story. The third thing, which is my own contribution, so I'm trying to sell you something here today, you don't have to buy it, but it's for sale, is a demand-driven hypothesis. All of these can be true at the same time, by the way. They're not mutually exclusive. But my demand-driven hypothesis is that rising incomes shift consumption towards skilled labor-intensive goods and services. And so then that has a general equilibrium effect on labor markets, where you increase the relative demand for skilled versus unskilled labor. Okay, is there evidence for this? And yeah, we have a recent paper in the QJE, Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2014, in which we show that there's a very high correlation between the skill intensity of a good and service in production and its income elasticity of demand in consumption. So there's something going on. There's a crucial correlation there. One thing is about production, one thing is about consumption, and they're highly correlated. So skilled labor-intensive goods are also high income elasticity of demand goods, and as income rises, demand naturally shifts toward these skilled labor-intensive goods and services. There's a number of other papers. This is one of the ones I like. It's by Boer and Kabowski in the AER 2012. And what it shows is, this is unfortunately just US data. The Caron, Foley, Markusen is the world, 112 countries. They show that the relative quantity of services, the relative price of services, and the expenditure share on services all rise relative to commodities over time. Okay, and that this shift is strong and it is persistent. They also show, so some people will say, well, there's lots of services that are very low-skilled. Think of in-person services of all kinds of things. But in fact, the increased demand for services has been highly concentrated in skilled labor-intensive services and not in the unskilled labor-intensive services. Okay? So this fits nicely with this kind of demand hypothesis. Okay, I don't know, I think maybe I won't go through any data, but this is from the QJE article, and those highlighted things in yellow are correlations between skilled labor intensity of a good or service and production and its income elasticity of demand and consumption. So in this article, when we get through it, although this was taken out of the final published version, we do a counterfactual experiment on a structural model. And the counterfactual experiment is to increase productivity in all sectors in all countries by 10%. So everyone's productivity increases in a very neutral fashion. And this is what happens in the model. It's a simulation on 144,000 equations and unknowns. If you want to see a big problem, this is a big problem, big computational problem. And the result is that it predicts that the skilled wage premium rises in all countries in the whole world. Okay? The shift as productivity increases, so everything is neutral on the production side of the model, but the non-homotheticity of preferences that we estimate means that there is this shift toward the skilled labor-intensive goods and services, which through general equilibrium interactions with the labor market raises the relative wage of skilled labor in all of our 112 countries. Okay, I think I'll skip those. So what? What's the relevance of this? Well, I kind of tried to think of a couple points here of why we should care about this. Basically, where this is suggesting that as income grows, businesses and planners need to anticipate that there's going to be considerable changes in the pattern of final demand. You know, the demand for many kinds of manufactured goods is going to become saturated. And as people get more income, they're going to, instead of another electronic toy to play with, they're going to want to go on international trips, for example. Okay, this will change very substantially, and for Chinese exporters, it's changing on the other side as well. So specifically, you can expect that demand for an awful lot of manufactured goods will slow relative to domestic and foreign incomes as time goes on. So I think the message is that business and government planners have to look at a shift towards services and away from manufacturing export-led growth. This has been a very successful strategy for China for 25 years now at least, manufacturing export-led growth. But if you believe some of the results we have and some of the data, it says that this may very well run out of steam, and you're really going to have to think about structural adjustment of the economy. The new normal is actually going to be about services. Okay, so success models exist. Singapore and Hong Kong, for example, now they're hard to compare to China because they're so much smaller. All right, it's a very, very stretch of a comparison. But over the last 30 or 40 years, they've gone from being very heavily manufacturing sectors to almost entirely service sectors. Okay, the share of manufacturing in the Hong Kong economy is down to about 3% of its GDP. Okay, so not a good comparison to the country the size of China, but perhaps there's some lessons there that people can take and absorb and adapt with Chinese characteristics, as we say. I love that phrase. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop there.